They say it's like kissing your sister, or one of the worst things that could happen in a competitive game between two teams or individuals. That I'm referring to the tie, which is about as American as croissants and free healthcare. Yet 3 of the 5 major, we'll include Canada here, American and Canadian sports use some form of tie system to avoid excessive regular season overtime, and for good reason. At its best, ties shorten game times and reduce injury risk, improve the quality of play in subsequent games, and provide an equitable resolution for 2 evenly matched teams. And though basketball doesn't use ties, its high-scoring nature really negates such a need. And this is what we're discussing today, one of the most controversial rule change proposals that have come about these last few years is whether to implement a tie system in Major League Baseball. Some of you might be privy, but ties actually can happen in baseball. So let's get that out of the way real quick. They can happen, though it's mostly due to weather or things of that nature. Back in the old days, if a team needed to catch a train, a game could end in a tie if at least 5 innings were played, and if the team needed to get to their train, and the game had to end to make that happen. That was one situation where a tie could happen. Now, the inclement weather, we haven't seen one in about 12 years. Back in 2005, I believe the Cincinnati Reds and the Houston Astros played to a tie because of weather, and the game wasn't made up because it didn't have any impact on playoffs. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about just a straight-up rule that would force a game to be called after 9 innings, no matter what the score was. I mean, tie or whatever. And then there was also another proposal to let the game go 10 innings in the event of a tie. So have 1 inning where the teams could push to make a score and win the game, or the game would end in a tie. So today we're discussing mostly the pros of this rule change. I'm a bit of a baseball purist, so off the top, I don't like it simply because it makes changes to the game. However, after reading the many arguments in favor, I am sliding towards, saying, yeah, let's do this. It'd be good for baseball. It'd be a good way to really not change the fundamental aspect of the game, in terms of time saving, though it doesn't really save that much time in the long run. The day-to-day games, yes, it could save some time. Overall, it would not if you're looking at an entire season. But, fans don't really watch the game over the course of an entire season in one sitting. So, without further ado, let's ask the question, what if baseball decided to adopt ties? Counterfactual here, ladies and gentlemen. You know how I love those. So, investigations were done, data submitted. All the data that I'm using right now is from baseballreference.com. You can check all this stuff if you want. Just go to baseballreference.com and search ties in the upper ribbon on the top of the screen. And you can verify anything you want. But full disclosure, I'm a fan of other sports as well. And I'm comfortable with ties, especially being someone who's participated in many sports through my career. As a rugby player, come to think of it, back in college, sometimes it was a godsend when a tie would be declared because that's a rough game. But anyhow, so I didn't really know what I would find when I started exploring the possible implications in introducing ties to baseball. I looked up NHL, NFL, soccer statistics, you name it, all sorts of different statistics to try and figure out the possible implications. And full disclosure, I need to add real quickly that the NHL does use a shootout to decide a game's winner after a 5-minute overtime, thus doing away with ties in a strict sense. But as the NHL still awards points in the standings for overtime or shootout losses, the system functions as a tie in the sense of rewarding teams for being tied at the end of regulation. Now, from 1994 to 2016, back to baseball here, on average, 185 American League and 221 National League regular season games had gone to extra innings each year. That's 8 and 9% respectively of the total games. What is the purpose of allowing these games to go 10 innings or more, or even just 9 innings or more? Well, here's some of the answers, rather. Players get tired, and its pitching staffs get worn out, although it is sort of exciting to see like an Ichiro go up and pitch because there's no more pitchers in an extra inning game. But nevertheless, all of this affects the quality of play in subsequent games and in the current, or the game being played in extra innings. Potential injury risks, they definitely increase, but that goes with being on the field longer. Fans have to choose whether it's live or listening on the radio or watching it on television or on the MLB app, between sticking around with the game that's already gone on for a while and for an uncertain amount of time. Remember, baseball is not a timed sport. Sometimes they just tune out without even caring about finding out a clear resolution. Stadium employees, I've read this argument. Stadium employees, local resources such as police and other related workers have to work overtime in these situations. In essence, they actually get paid for that. Couldn't find much data on that, but begs the question. If anyone knows, head over to Facebook, JimmyFlame77. Let me know. Correct me. Or you can just chat here because we are live today, baby. So what clear argument, other than the purity of the game, is there for insisting on playing more baseball than necessary in the regular season? Well, you got me there, because my only argument is the purity of the game and the history and the tradition, but all of that can be thrown by the wayside because I've already accepted other rules such as time between pitches, etc. You don't even notice that stuff. I remember when that was implemented into minor leagues back when I was working for the Zephyrs, and I didn't even notice it, even though the number was glaring right there in center field for the catcher to see. There was one behind the catcher for the pitcher to see, and of course for those sitting in the box to see. I'm okay with that. Didn't like it at first, hated it actually, and it's just sort of one of those things that I don't even notice anymore. Back to ties. So adopting ties after 9 innings would do away with a lot of things, offering a clear resolution to games and ensuring that everyone involved could better fit baseball into their life. Like, you would know that you're going to see a 9-inning game or potentially a 10th inning game, whether it's a tie or not. Fans would. There's also the consideration that affects baseball uniquely, and that's the quality of play. Back to soccer and hockey, there's a strong inclination for weaker teams to quote-unquote play for the tie, essentially playing defense and killing the clock. Now, that could be boring. It could be really boring to watch to some, maybe to the passing fan, but to those who know the strategy and those strategy elites, such as myself, don't mind that too much. Excuse me. But nevertheless, it can get really boring. And it's a great and a very strong, stout argument against ties. However, this does not apply to baseball, in which time has no meaning again, and each team is given equal and independent chances to score, 3 up, 3 down, or 3 outs. You got 4 balls, 3 strikes on each side, 3 outs, you know what I mean? It's like each side has an equal, independent chance to score. It's worthy to note that baseball is the only sport, at least the only one that I can think of, where the defense always controls the ball. Anyhow, there will be no such thing as playing for a tie, ladies and gentlemen, in baseball. That would just not be, you can't do that. I mean, it wouldn't happen. Even if you go to the bottom of the 9th in a 0-0 tie, why would a team play for the tie when they can play for the win and just end the damn thing? Again, like even go to the top of the ninth scenario where the away team playing for the win, because they know that the home team has their independent and equal chance in the bottom of the ninth to come up and try to win the dang thing. So there would be no playing for a tie, as there would be no conceivable reason to reduce offensive efforts and no practical way to increase your defensive posture. Again, defense controls the ball, and the home team always bats last, no matter what. Thus, ties would not change the way the game is actually played. There would be no new strategy, at least in terms of the fundamental rules of the game. The way the game is played, it would not change, which is a significant benefit when compared to the other sports leagues. But rhetorically speaking, what would adopting ties actually do to the structure of baseball? I'm going to let you ponder that for a second, because this would all come in I believe this would be a pertinent question for management, like strategizing an entire season. One thing comes to mind would be, instead of thinking about teams in terms of wins, we would have to think about teams in terms of winning percentages, which is the same damn thing. But we just don't refer to that in baseball because there's no need to, because wins do dictate the positioning of a team. So we don't refer to it as winning percentage like they do in football in the occasional tie, where a team would go over because of a tie or whatever on a winning percentage. Or, and like hockey, where they have a point system based on winning percentage, which actually derives from a winning percentage. Soccer is pretty much the same. Football, whatever you want to call it, same thing. Rugby is the same thing. So this would all be a management decision on how to strategize an entire season. Like what winning percentage would be sufficient to pretty much guarantee a playoff spot. Instead of how many wins do we need, it would be winning percentage. But it's almost synonymous, but not really, because there are some nuances to it. So how would baseball ties work? Some sports combine it with a point system. As I said, NFL, NHL, football. This would be awfully disruptive in baseball, but there's an easier way. Now, the system used by the NFL would be an easier way to figure out which team is where in terms of win percentage. Now, ties are very rare in American football, but even this knowledge of and even in this climate of macho competition recognizes that too much regular season overtime is a drag rather than free football or something that people actually want. After enough scoreless overtime is passed, a tie is declared. Winning percentage, rather than wins, is used to determine the standings, calculated, by counting any ties as sort of like half wins or a 0.5 instead of a whole number 1. Now, thus the formula for win percentage, which in baseball is currently wins divided by games, becomes the only slightly more complicated. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. You'd have to add the sum of wins and ties divided by 2, and then you divide that by the games. Complicated stuff, folks. Complicated stuff. If you can't do that, I don't know what to tell you. I just don't know what to tell you. Simple math, ladies and gentlemen. Simple, complicated math. That's going to destroy the history of our beloved national pastime. After this, everything else would work the same for baseball. Now, playoff teams are each division leader, and the next best 2 teams, all by winning percentage, currently wins divided by games, and all other tiebreakers, like head-to-head record, are unaffected. The only real adjustment would be in its lexicon. Journalists, fans, broadcasters, we're all used to using the term wins as the default comparison for teams, or losses. We'd have to shift and say winning percentage. We'd have to make that jump. It's solely a question of word choice, as wins is just a shorthanded way of describing win percentage. So, for example, instead of talking about needing 90 wins to make a wild card game, we would talk about needing a win percentage of 555. Now, that equation is resultant from a 90 and 72 record. 90 divided 72 ways is 0.555. Thus, we have a 555 winning percentage. But in a new proposed system, think about it like this. A team with a win-loss tie record of, say, 87, 69, and 6. Or 85, 67, and 10. Or any a number of numbers you can put out there. 84, 67, and 11. 85, 69, and 8. I don't know. And nevertheless, they would all have a winning percentage of 556 and potentially qualify. If that's the litmus, or rather the goal, those teams would qualify with 10 ties, 6 ties, whatever. Shifting the winning percentage as the core reference for a team's success can also, it's something that we've been doing in sabermetrics and statistical analysis for a long time. It helps compare teams across eras. So it's more relevant to compare the winning percentage of a team from 1954 or 1952 when they played 154 games to a team this year or last year when they did a 162 game season, than to compare their total wins. We're talking about an 8-game stretch there. I mean, so comparing those teams by win percentage is something we already do in statistical analysis and in sabermetrics and just looking at baseball through numbers. And we would simply ask the fans and the broadcast journalists and baseball writers to just simply adopt one simple term of art that we use on a daily basis, and that is win percentage. Football fans know this. So let's look at ties over the last couple of years. We can't go back too far because there's just too many numbers to crunch, and you only need a small sample to really make the point here. So to find out how this would look in practice, we're going to look at the American League, and we're going to look at we're going to basically, over the last few years, take all extra inning games and turn them into ties and see how it affects the playoff standings. Now, last year is pretty simple because there was only one meaningful change, and that is Baltimore and Toronto, which were the two wild card teams, are no longer tied. Toronto finishes clearly ahead, but still, but since Baltimore held, or not Baltimore, since Toronto holds the tiebreaker here and hosts the wild card game, there is no change here. Zero change. Now look at the final standings over in the American League as a whole. So the win percentage of the Boston Red Sox, let's take for instance, 86-65. Now if you add all their extra inning games in there, they'd have 11 ties. So their current win percentage is 574. Their new win percentage, when you add these ties in, when you consider the ties, is 565. Let's look at Baltimore. They would have been 83, 71, and 8. Their original win percentage, 549. Their adjusted win percentage would be 537. I think I just came up with a new term, adjusted win percentage. AWP. What's a team's AWP? You know what? All you sabermetrics folks, fellows out there, if you steal my term, I will punch you in the face. On and on and on and on. Let's go down to the Yankees. Not a very big... Actually, look at Toronto. So if you look at Toronto, their original 85, 64, and 13, their win percentage of 549 actually improves in their adjusted win percentage, their AWP, to 565. On and on. I could go on and on. In Tampa Bay, their new percentage, their adjusted win percentage drops from 420 to 417. So with all of these adjustments, there really isn't any change in the playoff system from last year. Now, whether that's an exception to the rule or not, we'd have to take more samples and look over time to see what the possible playoff scenarios could have been. But the playoff scenario last year doesn't change, not substantively. Baltimore still has to go to Toronto. They probably still lose not in a rematch, not this year. Baltimore owns them so far this year. But nevertheless, counterfactuals aside, Baltimore still goes to Toronto and they still lose, and the playoffs still go off like they do. Cleveland still ends up in the World Series, and they lose in that heartbreaking game to the Chicago Cubs. Go back to 2015, and we start seeing a slight change. So, originally, the Astros beat the Yankees in the AL wild card. And they ended up losing to the Royals in the division series. But with ties, ladies and gentlemen, the Angels actually win the second AL wildcard spot and travel to New York instead. Now, do the Royals beat the Angels or the Yankees in the division series and go on to win the World Series? Luckily, we don't do counterfactuals here. We don't have to adopt ties retroactively either. That could be a rule placed within the rule. No retroactive ties. In the original standings, the Angels only finished one game behind Houston, which doesn't seem like a whole lot. But in the adjusted win percentage, that means the world. In part because Houston had a pretty bad extra innings record, 5-7 versus 8-6, and convert all those games to ties, which levels the playing field, which that one game difference in the extra innings, which they could have been tied at the end of the regular season under the current rules, convert those games to ties, and the Angels come out ahead. The Angels go to New York, and there's no telling what kind of havoc would have been wreaked. Moving along here. So that's one example of where history is actually changed. But thank goodness the rule would not apply retroactively, because we'd never know if the Angels would go any further in that playoff. So 2014, another slight change here. Detroit finished one game ahead of KC, the Royals, for the division title. So they finished one game ahead of them. The Royals and the Tigers ended up virtually tied by winning percentage, but as Detroit held the tiebreaker, their head-to-head record, they would still have won the division, and the Royals would still have hosted the wild card game. But now the paper unfolds. Mariners fans, you should be excited about this, because Seattle, who originally finished a game behind the A's for the second wild card spot, in part due to a worse extra innings record. Seattle had a worse extra innings record. They went 4-7 versus 13-8. They now finish well ahead and travels to Kansas City for the wild card game. Now, I don't think anybody would want to trade the original wild card game, and a 9-8 12-inning comeback the Royals had over Oakland, for almost anything. But again, Seattle would be in that game. Seattle would be playing in that game if the adjusted win percentage were in play today. Now, just quickly looking at some American League final standings with ties, 2014. So Baltimore originally finished on top, but when you adjust they would have had 20 freaking ties that year, and their win percentage dropped from 593 all the way down to 568. If you look at the Yankees, win percentage of that year was 519. Even with 14 ties, their winning percentage remains at 519, not 514. 519 either way. Toronto, who finishes they finish up here with a 522 percentage. The Tampa Bay Rays, 481. Blah, horrible percentage, even though it would have increased their original winning percentage. and so on. Lots of changes here, ladies and gentlemen, but not drastic enough. We're talking adjusted win percentage. So over the course of these seasons that we've just looked at, adopting a tie would make minor but very significant changes. 2 wildcard teams are different, but in both cases by a very narrow margin. So that begs the question, like, how would managers adjust their play, etc.? What would their goals be towards the second half? At the second half of the season, if they knew they were playing for win percentage and they were setting their sights on a wild card, say they stood no chance of catching the first place or whatever, but they're still in running for a decent win percentage. How does that adjust their strategy? We don't know yet. But teams are rewarded under this scheme for what they do in 9 innings. 9 innings. Rather than in extra innings. So teams being rewarded with wins or losses, after 9 would just simply come to an end. I mean, the fundamental, the most important part of this game is played in 9 innings. This would reward teams for what they do in those 9 innings and nothing else. So is it worth it? There's still a strong argument for the status quo. And again, like I said at the top of this program, the one being that there already is a tie system in the game, in that, rain delays. There's no more travel delays, really. There's no more travel delay ties. Excessive time. What if the power goes out in a stadium or something for way too long? Inconsequential ties. I don't know. But there is still a pretty strong argument for the status quo, and so we're going to look at some numbers right here, and most of this is in terms of time. We're going to look at it broadly, and then I'll conclude with what it does more narrowly. Ties might be more equitable and efficient, but they are a solution in search of a problem. Think about that. According to calculations, any given team plays 30 to 35 extra innings of baseball per regular season, which is about 2% of the total. I'm talking total games, about 2% of it is played in overtime. Overtime, that's funny. Punch me! Extra innings. I've been reading too many NFL stats. If you consider the average inning, lasts 17 minutes. Probably closer to 19 or 20. That's less than 10 extra hours of baseball per team per season. So it's very easy to dismiss this whole idea as unnecessarily disruptive. Yet the benefits aren't easily quantified. You just can't really quantify these benefits. So more certainly for fans, players, and workers and baseball players, we're talking about healthier players and better play, adopting something that doesn't really change much in terms of the broad spectrum of time doesn't mean it's overtly disruptive. It just doesn't disrupt it that much. It's not likely to happen, but it was this is a fun, rhetorical exercise. This whole idea of ties. Just think of the word ties, and you've got baseball purists puking. I'm just going to say it outright. But then again, the baseball purists don't like change at all. I, for one, am completely open to the idea. After taking an objective look at the numbers, and thinking about time more narrowly, which I'm going to get to right now. Narrowly, say you're sitting at the ballpark and it goes to extra innings, and it's Tuesday night, and you have to work at 6 o'clock. You have to be up for work at 6 o'clock in the morning. I have seen so many stadiums empty after 9.5, 10, or after the 10th inning. I think most people stick around to see if anything happens in the 10th. But stadiums just empty so quickly, and people have to leave with no resolution. The fans leave with no resolve, and with that, feeling in their stomach, at least for those who care. And they'd leave without finding out what happened, essentially. Adopting a tie, which I've already explained and defended as being something that is pretty much not going to disrupt the game at all. In fact, it gives teams that deserve, that are more deserving of a playoff spot, inconsequential to teams that actually finish first in their respective leagues and in their divisions, etc. It hasn't been. It's been of no consequence to that over the numbers we looked at. We can leave extra innings for the playoffs because people don't leave those games. It's freaking playoffs, and plus you got to spend like $1,000 on a ticket anyway. No one's leaving that game. You know, if baseball wants to address problems, alleged problems, purported problems concerning time that I don't really care about, but here's one way to do it without affecting the game at all, really. Here's one way to cut down. Here's one way to allow the fans to leave the stadium or to tune out of their radios and televisions with a resolution after 9 innings. Going into a game knowing that they are going to see 9 innings of great baseball action. And that's it. So leave the drama where the drama is. In the playoffs, we can leave the playoffs where they are. We don't have to change the rules, the playoff rules for ties. I mean, I don't even know how that. I haven't even thought of how that would work. Anyway, but that's that. So quickly before we end today's program, let's talk about one of the peculiar. Well, let's talk about something peculiar that does happen on occasion, real quick, and that is the tie. Tie games can happen, but you know, as I mentioned earlier, I did mention the Cincinnati-Houston game back in June 30 of 2005. The ties right now are rigged beyond belief. In that game that I just referred to, the game was called due to rain after 7 innings in a 2-2 tie. However, in the early days of baseball, ties were not uncommon. They happened a lot, actually. So to the baseball purists out there, if you want to talk about baseball purity, ties used to be common. There were 3 standard reasons, though, and these are the rigged reasons. A game might be called due to darkness. This is long before stadium lights. It might be called due to rain, which has happened in more modern times, or if a team had a train to catch, or transportation issues. If and when they stopped play, the score was even, the game was declared a tie, assuming that 5 innings were played, or nothing at all. If they didn't get to 5 innings, they would just write it off in the books as if a game had not been played. It would not statistically matter. This became less common over the decades, as you know. Once the artificial lights came into being, darkness was no longer an issue. Travel technology has improved to the point where teams are chartering planes to get around. Thank goodness for the Seattle Mariners, right? And most of the West Coast teams. Improved drainage of baseball fields, etc. Don't underestimate the influence of drainage on baseball history, ladies and gentlemen. Back in the day, once enough rain had come down and they all went home, even if the rain stopped, the field would turn into a giant mud pit. Games could be canceled for days upon days. Lots of games not played because of the weather. Modern ballparks have put in some serious thought into their drainage systems. In fact, inventing new drainage systems that would in turn be used out in public, et cetera, because of its need and for its technological advancements. Combine this with a willingness to finish the game at 3 a.m, if that's what it takes. And games don't get called on account of rain nearly as often as they used to. Then there's the traditional suspended game, the traditional principle that once everyone goes home, the game is over. Come what may. In the 50s, the rules were amended to allow for a game to actually be suspended and later picked up where it had been left off. Before, if a game was called, if it was 3 o'clock in the morning and there was no fans left in the stands, you didn't pick up where you left off. That rule was amended in the 50s, and they still happen to this day. Whether it be a league time limit, a legal curfew, light failure, they do happen. and in some jurisdictions, darkness on a game being played on a Sunday in a doubleheader, where lights were not allowed to be turned on. Yes, this is one of those Puritan rules that don't really exist anymore, but they're still in the books in some places. Notably absent from the list was the game being stopped by rain, but that wasn't the point of the rule. I suspect that the real point was that lighting technology was a bit iffy at the time, and light failures were just common, and they needed to be addressed in the rules. There was no real way to allow. You just couldn't suspend a game and allow it to be played, from where it left off at a later time if the lights were to blow, whatever. But the concept of a suspended game was later extended to correct a perceived injustice. Suppose a visiting team was behind in the end of the eighth, but surged and took the lead in the top of the ninth, immediately followed by a downpour. It would seem unfair that they should get a loss under those circumstances because the momentum was clearly pushed in their direction. They clearly had the momentum, and momentum is a big factor. It's one of those big intangible, hard to look at objectively factors that is very real in this game. And stopping someone's momentum, in a way, team's momentum, to simply have them play cold the next day is just, seems a little unfair. So rain was definitely not in the equation when they came up with the suspended game rule. But back to ties. They can occur, as I said, but the stars have to be aligned as such that you almost have to have the entire solar system in perfect alignment with the sun, with the Milky Way being flat like it was, at least from our perception, like it was a few years back. There's an exception to suspended games. The game is usually finished on the next day on the same ground, but between, but between the two clubs. And if the game isn't scheduled, it is finished at their next game at the other side's field. A later elaboration says another day will happen, however inconvenient, if the game might affect the final standings. This has happened throughout baseball history, where if the game does have an impact on the playoff standings, they definitely play it, come hell or high water. Often a day after, I think there's a day reserved after the last day of the season for things like that to happen. So if a game is stopped with at least 5 innings played and the score is tied, and if the two teams are not scheduled to meet again that season, and if the game would not affect the final standings, then the Major League Baseball's offices would say to heck with it and leave it as a tie. It could happen. It could happen. And what we are talking about today is, should we just officially implement a tie rule? Because technically you can still have a tie. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes today's episode. Go over to Jimmy Flame 77 on Facebook, at Jimmy Flame 77 on Twitter. Follow us, baby. Let me know your thoughts on ties in baseball. I'd love to hear them. I'm warming up to the idea. I hope that after looking at the numbers objectively, you will too. To rebrief what we discussed, we just simply discussed, discussing an adjusted win percentage as opposed to just win percentages, and determining standings, and determining playoff positioning and wild card spots. As you've seen, only a few teams have been affected. The Los Angeles Angels, most notably, and it didn't even affect last year's wild card, with Baltimore still going to Toronto with the adjusted win percentage, including the tie. But yeah, let me know what you think. I'm liking this idea, especially as a fan. I'm talking about single game time. I'm liking it. As usual, you catch us on Google Play, iTunes, Apple, baby. Check us out. We're all over the place. Over at Spreaker, on the Stitcher app. No reason why you can't be listening to the Baseball Fury. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Jimmy Flame signing off for the Baseball Fury. And don't forget, watch a lot of baseball, daddy. Greatest sport in the world. Until next time.